I think that the wisdom of the presentation of Islam by the Hizmet movement is to recognize that Islam is not monolithic, that Islam is diverse, and there are many different expressions of Islam, including in Turkey. And I think that what the Hizmet movement does is to say, people don't present it to me this way, this is based on of social justice, even when that My name is Reid Locklin. I teach in the Interdisciplinary Christianity and Culture program at St. Michael's College in the University of Toronto. I do my research in the area of Hindu-Christian studies. My views of the Hizmet movement are complicated, right? So the Hizmet movement is a movement to which I have enormous affection. Members of the Hizmet movement over the years have become friends of me and my family. I also know indirectly of the educational work of the Hizmet movement through my student who was educated in a boarding school in Turkey, but also through now I've met lots of folks who've come through the boarding school system of Hizmet, primarily from Central Asia. And so I know something indirectly about the schools. And then of course I know what I read in the papers, including especially the Western press, but also today's Zaman and other papers. And so I know the movement as a community of friends. I know the movement as an institutional partner of dialogue initiatives that we've had at our university. And I also know the movement sort of one step removed. I look at it kind of like comparable to movements in the Catholic Church. So I think of it always as, I always say, a base ecclesial community of Turkish Islam, that it's a movement that's lay-driven, that's religiously motivated, but also has a kind of very specific social purpose, and that I would call it, from my Catholic tradition, I would call it a charism. It has a distinctive charism that makes it not generic, not simply Turkish or simply Muslim, but having its own distinctive mission that's been given to it by Fethullah Gulen, and one that has attracted a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. I think that that there are sort of two primary contributions, and I think of them as intellectual contributions, right? Because I'm an academic, and this is the way I tend to think. I think that the first contribution is to say that religion can and will be a force for building the common good, if religion is not always preoccupied with religious matters. That religious traditions contribute to the common good by becoming genuinely interested in it, and treating questions of education, questions of social justice, questions of interreligious harmony, and just generally communal harmony, by treating those questions on their own terms, and not solely through the lenses of one's own religious tradition. I think that's one contribution, is to say that in a way, how do you encourage interreligious harmony? Well, you have meals together, and you think about questions of social justice in your communities, and you think about what it means to educate people. And then I think the other big contribution is to say that the foundation of harmony is friendship. And so you try to create contexts in which persons who are different meet socially and can become friends. And that's maybe most dramatically symbolized by the various trips to Turkey, which people from many different places have a chance to visit Turkey and meet lots of different people in an informal, friendly setting. But I think it also is indicative of the work that, for example, the IDI has done in Toronto. I think that the Hizmet movement represents Islam indirectly, and I think this is on purpose. that I think that that the Hizmet movement has said and has made a decision. I mean, every person that I know in the Hizmet movement is a devout Muslim, and I don't think there's any question about that, at least insofar as I'm able to tell from outside. Right? That's been my experience. But I think that the wisdom of the presentation of Islam by the Hizmet movement is to recognize that Islam is not monolithic, that Islam is diverse. There are many different expressions of Islam, including in Turkey. And so I think that the Hizmet movement has said, well, we're ambassadors of a particular lens on Islam, a particular understanding of Islam that's as much mystical as it is Muslim, that's as much Turkish as it is Muslim, that's as much committed to a certain vision of civic society as it is Muslim. And that people encounter Islam not just because they might be interested in Islam, but because they're interested in mysticism, or they're interested in Turkey, or they're interested in civic society. And so I think that there's a kind of deliberate and I think elegant indirection, which is to say we're not simply coming to you as Muslims, we're coming to you as people who are connected with the Sufi tradition, or people who are interested in questions of racial profiling in the police services in Toronto. I think that dialogue itself, as a Christian, I would say, that it has a kind of theological importance. That I think to be religious, to be committed in a profound way, is also to be open to others. And I think I have distinctive reasons for this from my own Christian tradition, why I think this is the case, why I think Christians are necessarily open to dialogue, or should be. But my Muslim dialogue partners have told me and given me examples from the Quran that offer a similar impetus. So I think one impetus is theological. I think it can be criticized from a variety of angles. So I don't know the criticisms in Turkey, but I would guess that they would be of two types. So I would guess that one would be from, say, maybe more Muslims who would be observant and would be critical of dialogue. And I think that sometimes that's motivated by fear, that dialogue can hurt commitment to one's own tradition. I think sometimes it's motivated by a particular reading of Scripture. And of course, this struggle is the same in the Christian tradition. So I think that the answer to that, I mean, again, I can only create an analogy from my own experience. And the answer to that is to say, well, I think that dialogue often increases one's commitment to one's own tradition, because one learns about one's own tradition in the course of talking with another. I also just think that it's a matter of sort of interpretation of one's core texts and traditions, and that my guess as a non-Muslim would be that the interpretations of the Quran that affirm dialogue are better interpretations. But in a certain sense, that's not up to me. Now, I would guess that the other criticism would come from a more secularist agenda and would say that this is a cover of some kind, maybe for a missionary agenda, maybe for a political agenda. I have friends who are secular but who come out of Christian backgrounds who are deeply suspicious of Catholic-Muslim dialogue because they see it, for example, as a conspiracy of interest around suppressing women's rights or suppressing political rights. They perceive both the Catholic Church and most forms of Islam as working in that way. And I think the answer to that is to not do those things, right? To be as overt as one can about being open to any perspective that comes to the table, and to affirming the pursuit of social justice, even when that puts us in partnership with people who might not see that exactly the way that we do. I think that charitable activity has, especially when it crosses the borders of states, when it becomes international charitable activity, has been, over the last 200 years, associated largely with Christianity, and regarded with some suspicion, and some of that suspicion is warranted. But one of the reasons why it's been founded that way is because that's where a lot of wealth and power has been located in the West, in the in the north, I guess we should say better, in North America, Europe. And I think that part of the spread of charitable activities, I mean, Muslims have engaged in charitable activities throughout the entire history of Islam. There's nothing new about that. The formation of organizations that do, say, international development work in Muslim and non-Muslim contexts, I think is a sign of the shifting and the we could say the pluralizing of power centers in the world. And I think in that sense it's a good thing. Charitable activity, I would say, is self-evidently good, but not to all, right? There's always the question, and I support a lot of charitable organizations of a number of different sorts, that the difficulty with charity is whether it empowers or disempowers the people who receive it. Emergency charity work is usually almost always applauded. So after an earthquake, after a hurricane, I don't think anybody questions that kind of charitable work is good. But the broader charitable work, I think one can ask questions of Hizmet that one also asks questions of the International Organization of Development and Peace of the Catholic Church, for example. And some of those questions maybe are about motive, but more of them are about when charitable work is sponsored from a place of relative privilege to places that are relatively non-privileged or are marginalized or underserved. How much of that is infantilizing and is encouraging relationships of dependence, and how much of it is actually empowering? My sense of that with regard to the Hizmet movement would be very parallel to any other organization. And it would be to say that on the one hand, I think people who engage in charity with any sense of solidarity at all often become the people who are most attentive to those kinds of questions and most concerned about it and most suspicious of relationships of dependence. So I tend to see charity as a way into broader practices of empowerment. But here as with education, I think the critics are good. It's good to have critics because hopefully they keep us honest.
So if you look at Islam, we keep on saying Islam is a religion of peace and submission to the will of God. And peace is something that the Hizmet movement has been, and Fethullah Gulen has been very, very focused on. Peace through love, through harmony. And Islam teaches love. It doesn't teach hatred. In fact, Islam says to kill one life is to kill humanity. And that type of progressive thinking, that type of approach, it's the true approach to Islam. And I think the Hizmet movement and Fethullah Gulen are on that path, the true path to Islam.
Interfaith dialogue, as Hizmet has demonstrated in its iftar dinners, begins with a real social relationship. People have to actually know each other. They have to actually care about each other. And that's the starting point.